Welcome to Agile Roots 2010. Sponsored by Version 1, Rally Software, Vireo, Emirsys, Agile Alliance, and X-Mission Internet. No One Wants Your Stupid Process by Jeff Patton.
I'm Jeff Patton. I've been involved with software development since the early 90s. I started software development working with a company that was either wise enough or stupid enough to put developers working directly with end users and customers. I worked with a company that built commercial software. So the users of our system, there were lots of them, they were diverse, and really I couldn't count on getting the same story about what they wanted from multiple users. So we had to learn very early on that if we wanted a successful product, we had to listen, we had to learn, and we had to understand how they were using our software. So throughout the 90s, I built software and worked in small teams, and things worked pretty well. Let's see if I can clip this story a little bit. Right around 2000, I was lucky enough to get drafted into a company that was doing this weird new process called extreme programming. Jeff! And I worked with that guy there. Now that there's someone here that I worked with in 2000, this rules out all the lies I was about to tell. But I immediately hated this company and hated this process. The first thing they made me do was choose to be either a smart person that understood what to build or a smart person that understood what to code, but I couldn't be both. I had to be either a customer or a developer. And because my domain knowledge looked too good to waste, I started as a customer. And after a couple months doing that, I was ready to kill myself because customer in an XP context didn't meant I did what I used to do. It didn't meant I went out and talked with people, worked with customers, worked with end users, and worked hard to understood what people needed. It meant that I worked with a bunch of people who had strong opinions of what should be built, and we argued with each other a lot over what should be built, and then tried to speak with one voice and work with developers to give them our stories. So happily, luckily, this company let me become a developer, and I was happy and blissful, and I learned some good development skills, worked with some very good people, and didn't have to worry about the success of the product. The product didn't succeed. The company ultimately did something with the product, but ever since then, I've been on a mission to take this process that had these elements that I really loved and do something better with it, put it back together, get a process out or get a way to work out that let me both be strong from an engineering perspective and actually get a good product out the other end. So let's see if I can tear through a few messages I want to leave this morning to sort of set stage for the rest of this conference. I want to start by describing what I'm starting to notice over the last 10 years as the process racket, this thing we're doing to keep selling ourselves on more and better process. I want to talk about why this doesn't work, why off-the-shelf process doesn't work, and why we keep falling into this. And then I want to come back to, how do we build a process that gets us something good in the end, bring it back into balance, where it's partly about engineering and partly about just focusing on what a good product should be. I want to frame this and touch this back to a story. The story is about the CEO of a company that I work with in Brazil. His name is Juarez. If you're from El Paso, you might mispronounce his name as Juarez. But in Brazil, it's Juarez. Juarez is the CEO of a company called Globo.com. In Brazil, Globo, the conglomerate, is a bit like Time Warner in the United States. Globo owns the newspapers, television, cable stations, radio stations, and Globo.com builds web properties that serves all these folks. Juarez started this as a small internet service provider, and he helped bring this up from the ground up. He's a CEO that walks around the office, is well known, and everyone knows him. And one of the last times I was there happened to be on his birthday. That's a lot of people with Juarez's face on, because one of the things that they did on his birthday was make lots of Juarez masks, so everyone got to be Juarez for the day. And yes, everyone in Brazil looks just like that. So they carried masks around to Juarez and surprised Juarez with a cake. And Juarez, everybody celebrated his birthday with him. This is a CEO that cares a lot about the business that he helped build. Right now, they've got 23 teams that number between 8 and 12 people each. They're building lots of software, and they build software that, again, supports newspapers, television stations, radio stations, all these things. And if you were to walk into this place, they are a model of agile success. Every team stands up, every team writes user stories, every team has a scrum master, every team builds in short sprints, and they are using strong engineering practices, test-driven development, everything that, well, almost everything the Agile community has prescribed, they're using. But Juarez is, on my last visit, Juarez is not happy at all. Juarez helped build this company from the ground up, and he knows that a long time ago, everyone used to take pride in the product that they were building. They're building software that almost everybody with a computer in Brazil sees. It's the software that people go to tune in to see what's going on the World Cup. It's the software that people go to read news stories from the newspaper and on the television news. It's the software you tune in to go to see what happened on Big Brother last night. This is important stuff, and Juarez is concerned that, well, the software that they're building is not good, and all he keeps hearing about is discussions about acceptance criteria. And well, it wasn't particularly good because the acceptance criteria didn't say it had to be particularly good. They're running into situations where things are finishing slightly late or not on time, and where people used to rally and work together to get things done on time. He keeps hearing about, well, estimates and velocity, and the velocity, well, there's a magic, one of those magic 8 balls where you shake it and it turns up and says velocity says no on the delivery time. And he keeps hearing discussions about that. Basically, he feels like the soul has been sucked out of his company, and he wants people to start caring again. Juarez talks with a guy named Danilo. Danilo is in charge of development, and Danilo helped bring Agile development in. Danilo wanted to bring some sanity to the software development process, and to a degree it really has. A lot better engineering process, a lot more steady pace. People are really talking with each other, but talking with each other using these rules of Agile development. And Juarez talks to Danilo, and Danilo says, well, the problem is the people in the product ownership role aren't doing their jobs well, and it's their role to describe the product and say when it's done, and we really need to improve those people. Now, I shouldn't feel bad about any of this because that's how I get most of my work, but there's something inherently going wrong here. Let's see if I can pick it apart and see if it makes as much sense to you as it does to me. So let's talk about this process racket that's going on. The process racket starts with an executive who's having real trouble with their process, and they phone up a process expert. And, well, they say, our customers are complaining because they hate our software. We believe that if we could ship more of it faster, that would solve our problems. And there's a process person that always has a bit of an answer. They've got a process that'll fix things. This is where we enter the cycle. Let's see if those slides come up okay. I've painstakingly produced these slides by drawing them on big cards. The process, or the cycle, starts with our process not working, and we proceed to try a new process. After trying for a while, things still aren't working, at least not quite right. Some things are better, some things are worse. And happily, we've gotten the help of a consultant who tells us that we're doing it wrong. We should try harder. And if we try harder, we keep going around this loop a few times. Now, for anyone who's been in the waterfall business for years, this should ring a bell. I know that when waterfall doesn't work, it was because we weren't doing it right, and our job was to try harder, and we get it right next time. And, well, we go around this loop over and over until finally we get fed up and we find a shiny new process, and we start the loop again. It seemed like Agile might be immune to that sort of loop. We wouldn't fall into this trap of saying we're doing the process wrong. But I'm starting to see lots of evidence that we are doing the process wrong. So let's look at the now notorious Nokia test, or the Scrum butt test. Now, who has not heard of the Nokia test or the Scrum butt test? It's okay if you haven't. Good. Let's see if we can explain this. The idea is that you're doing Scrum, but you leave some things out. We're doing Scrum, but we don't deliver software every sprint. We're doing Scrum, but we don't do reflection sessions. And people started calling this the Scrum but, because we were doing the process, but we were omitting what Scrum believed were key things. So everybody, we're going to quickly run through the Scrum butt test to see, well, who in the room is not doing an Agile process right now? The guy I used to work with in 2000. I don't know what that means, but who in the room would self-identify as doing Scrum as an Agile process right now? I can tell I'm in Utah. Well, Scrum these days is the dominant Agile process, and play for a minute here, and let's see if you're doing Scrum really well. To do Scrum really well, this is, granted, I'm taking this 9-step test and I'm going to the top level here, but for the first level, we have a fixed iteration length of 4 weeks or less. So keep a mental note here and see if you're developing in an Agile context and you have a fixed iteration length and it's 4 weeks or less, you're doing well. Now, as far as I know, this is the only time where two guys in a leadership role can get together and compare lengths of anything, and the guy with the shortest thing wins. But with sprint length or iteration length, that's good. The software is tested and deployed each sprint. Is everyone doing that? There are good user stories tied to specifications, but only as needed. This is kind of a big one. I've conjoined a couple here. The product owner motivates the team and has a clear product backlog estimated by the team before the sprint planning meeting. Does everyone have that? Does anyone have that? Just checking, because you'd be doing Scrum wrong if you weren't. And the product owner can measure return on investment based on real revenue, cost per story point, or other metric. Everyone have that? Our estimates have an error rate of less than 10%. I'm sure we're all there. The burn down chart only burns down when a story is done, tested and deployed. Let's hit a couple more here. No one is disrupting the team. Only the scrum roles exist in the team, and those are going well. And then finally, the team is in this hyper-productive state, meaning they're performing at a level, at an order, well, they're performing at least double what a normal team would. Now, this is how if you pass all these things, you're doing Scrum really well. And if you don't, you should get back to work on your Scrum process and keep working at those things. I'm seeing more and more of these sorts of "you're not doing Agile right" sorts of tests that drop people back into the sort of a guilt-driven process. How many people in the room are doing a process where, well, they're supposed to be doing something, but they're not? This is an AA kind of a meeting here, so you can come clean. I know I'm supposed to be doing something, but I'm not. I'm starting to see this sort of guilt-driven process and this push to try and follow the process. And I can't read this. I'm seeing a lot of processes that emphasize what you're not doing. And talking with Andrew about this, this starts to ring a bell. This person named Eric Hoffer, which I haven't read before, but the quote is fabulous, that every great cause begins as a movement, it becomes a business, and eventually degenerates into a racket. This thing that I cared a lot about with Agile development is going through the cycle a little bit quicker than I expected. But there's some light, there's some things that make me feel a little bit better. We're starting to learn a little something about process, and over this next decade, things may feel a little bit better. We're starting to recognize that the processes we follow, well, they don't work off the shelf, that we shouldn't fall into this cycle of taking a published process or the way someone else tells us to do things and keep trying it and failing over and over again. So I want to start with this model that I first saw Jared Spool draw, or actually someone that works with Jared. And it starts with a bit of an arc here, and in the middle is the idea of process. To the left of that are techniques or practices maybe, but we've got these techniques that when strung together in some sort of sequence make up our process. And then to the left of that is what Jared refers to as tricks, these improvisations, these things that we do when we don't have a practice, when we're in a particular situation, in a particular context, and I need to get something done, so I invent something. So tricks eventually get named and get called techniques. Things like user stories fit into that category. In fact, a lot of what we do in Agile development fits in the category of used to be a trick. Now, if we go to the right of process, we have, and this is Jared's terminology, so don't look in the dictionary to find these precise definitions. But he'll distinguish a process from a methodology because a methodology is documented and enforced. We know it's the process, we document it, and we expect other people to follow it. And once we've documented it and we expect that, then we can start to tell them they're doing it wrong. And then at the far end, Jared places dogma. This is where we do things because that's the way we've always done things, and we don't question it. So Jared put this little thing together as a result of spending a lot of time inside of organizations, and for him, he was looking for a perfect design process, a perfect user experience design process. And he thought by going through lots of different organizations, he would start to see these patterns of these good processes emerged. But in fact, what he saw was the exact opposite. That the organizations that were really succeeding, the organizations that really put out good products, rarely had a really defined process and often had lots and lots of tricks, they did lots of improvisation. They thought on their feet, they figured out what to do and did things, and the counterpunch here is that he saw companies that had a document methodology were almost always certain to be failing. He didn't need to find out much about the process they were following, just that they had written it down and were telling everyone else to follow it. This is bad news for people who write down process and tell people to follow it. So why would this be the case? For those, Andrew asked if anybody had read the Agile Manifesto. Again, this is a cycle that's repeated for a long time. In the late 1990s, there were the rise of things like the Rational Unified Process and the CMMI and other big formal processes, and there was lots of dogma to watch out for. And in 2001, 17 guys got together and wrote the Agile Manifesto, and its distinguishing characteristic is that it doesn't describe a process, that it describes a set of values and principles, things that we care about, like individuals and interactions, in fact, over process and tools, working software, collaborating over negotiating contracts, and paying attention and responding to change. And if you mine the 12 principles of the Agile Manifesto, you'll get lots of working words if you just boldface the things that become mantras for Agile people. Early and continuous delivery, simplicity, sustainable development. Those are all characteristics of a process that we believe is Agile. And all of those words start to hint at practices, but they don't say sequence, they don't say how it's supposed to be done. So in 2001, with the Agile Manifesto, we sort of had the right idea. We had published these values and principles, and someone described this to me a couple weeks ago, that this was really a bit of a peace treaty between the 17 guys that were there who had strong disagreements on specific process and practice, but agreed that they shared common values. Given some sorts of common values, we eventually end up with some kind of practices and process. But the variety of practices and process we can end up with from a shared set of values is really broad. And why? Well, I thought to myself, why would that be? And I've thought about it for a while. Why isn't there a perfect process we could all follow? But there's a couple other factors missing here. One of the biggest ones is, well, that's not taken into account in most processes, is our context. How many, context means the stuff, the soup, the process swims in. How many people work in our company? What are the risks of failure, of other sorts of risks? What's the prevailing culture of that organization? Those things have to be taken into account, and the process we arrive at is a function of those things as well. And then one other thing that enters in here are these laws. Theories are laws. For instance, gravity is a theory. It's a pretty good one, and most of us respect it. There are other theories that we leverage in an Agile context, things around communication. We know that two people face-to-face or in front of a whiteboard can communicate in higher fidelity than two people over the phone, or two people exchanging email messages, or one person reading a document. We can leverage that and use that theory in our process. We know with queuing theory that if we've got a process of dependent actions, that the process is only as fast as the slowest workstation. There are theories about the way we learn, and we take those things into account. So the process we end up with has to be a function of some shared values and principles of our context. We can leverage these sorts of theories, and eventually we come up with a process that works inside of our organization. Now, this is a bastardization of my friend Alistair's model, and Alistair is famous for, well, when you see a list of agile processes, often the big ones are extreme programming and Scrum, and always in an honorable mention slot is Crystal. And oftentimes the reason it's honorable mention is because Alistair is so not specific about what the heck it actually is. The problem with that is Alistair knows too much. He won't specify exactly what it is. He knows that one size doesn't fit all, that this is a big problem. That's a hazy picture of Alistair in there, with his hair really messy, as it always is. So I want to go through, there's a couple things. Now, from that, we know that the process has to be specific to our organization, our values. It has to acknowledge a lot of things, but I want to hit one thing that for me is a pretty important forgotten law. The law is that the software we propose is hypothesis. We don't know if it's going to work. We don't know if it's good. We don't know if it's going to be valuable. And in fact, we're right less than you'd think. Now, I started out in the 90s building software, and either I was really stupid or, well, I was wrong a lot. And I came to believe that, well, either I was really stupid or this isn't so easy. And the idea that we would just write user stories and prioritize them by business value is a difficult one, and always has been for me. There's a guy I like named Marty Kagan. Marty's written a book called Inspired. Inspired is a book about product management. Marty talks about the pairing of user experience people and product managers as kind of a symbiotic thing that figures out what this product should be. And listening to Marty in a class, he basically said that, well, you can 50 to 80% of all the software we ship fails to accomplish its objectives. He said it a little bit harsher to me when he first said it. Basically, if you're really good at this stuff, you can expect to be right about 40% of the time. And if you're not so good, maybe 20 or 30, and if you stink at it, maybe 10. Marty was in charge of product development for eBay for a long time and helped build up that practice. And he describes the idea of putting features in the software and testing them and pulling them back out again. Any good software process will put features in, fully expecting to pull half of them out. How many people work in organizations that pull half their features out? I knew Arlo would. Oftentimes we'll see this, this is a slide from the Standish Group's deck about the chaos reports, and I'll see a lot of other Agile people here. It describes software that's features that are rarely or never used. When we add the rarely and never together, we end up with, I believe, 64% on this 2002 report. That's an improvement over the 70-something percent that it's been in past years. But the truth is 64% of what gets built, according to them, is rarely or never used. Now we can debate this. I know that the fire extinguisher in my house is rarely or never used, but doesn't mean that I should remove it. But the truth is we build features that people don't like. This is the beloved Clippy, and really, when we put these features in a product, they really all seem like good ideas at the time. And when people, I see people show that Standish report, and they say, yeah, you know, look, 2/3 of the stuff we put in our software is rarely or never used. As if we could just say, oh my gosh, I hadn't thought of that. Let's just not build those. As if we knew which ones were going to be rarely or never used. It isn't that simple. It's a delivery time that we really start to understand value. So, pretend for an instance that you had the opportunity to build an integrated music management and a portable music player. And you came up with something that was a high demand, a high value solution for that space. And then you came up with something that was not so high demand and consequently not so high value. That's a Zune from Microsoft, if you can't see it. And the product is not without its fans. But still, the product doesn't do all that well. This is at the tail end of 2009 was a report from CNET News that, basically things went bad for Microsoft in December. And when you dig in, the Zune platform revenue decreased $100 million, or 54%, reflecting a decrease in device sales. Microsoft said that's quite a drop. In contrast, the iPod sales did really well, and since graphs do really well, I wanted to graph that so you can see the difference in revenue. There's a sliver there next to that. So if you've got a story in a backlog for a Zune and you've got a story in a backlog for an iPad, what is the business value of your stories, relatively speaking? It's quite possible the business value in the Zune backlog may be negative. Certainly if you're Microsoft, you don't know. The problem is the stories we're holding may or may not be valuable, and they may be fairly risky. That's a crumpled up lottery ticket. It's hard to see that, and for better or worse, a lot of the stories that we work with fit into that category. So let's go back to Juarez and see if we can finish his story. One law that Agile isn't always taking into account is that software is a hypothesis. And if we knew that, we might add practices or change the way we're doing things. For Global, they develop software for things like World Cup soccer. They have an equivalent of what is fantasy football in the U.S. For their World Cup soccer site. Wow, you really can't see that. But it says, for Globo.com's context, late delivery isn't an option. And it's not. They can't say, gosh, we're behind on that World Cup soccer thing. Could we just delay the World Cup by a couple weeks? We promise we'll catch up. Then the other thing is Juarez and his values. Juarez, this is a company he's built up. He values working together to build software we're all proud of. He's used to coming into work and seeing everyone proud of what they're doing and not arguing about velocity. If we take those things and apply them into our model, we end up with Globo's context, where the market they're in doesn't allow late delivery. We end up with Juarez's values about collaboration and shared ownership, and we apply this hypothesis that software isn't always valuable. And the process we end up with is different. There's lots of other things to apply, but again, the Agile Manifesto and much of what's written in Agile doesn't take those things into account. On my last visit there, Juarez was ready to kill this whole Agile thing because it just wasn't working. And we talked about the purpose here is not to follow the process. The purpose here is to own the process. The process is not the boss of you. It's your process. What do you want out of this process? And let's look at what we need to do to get it. And it's through discussion with him that we ended up with those sorts of things, among other things. So if we start to take some of these things into account, we can start to bring our process back into balance. And going back to this idea, one of the things, back to that bad spiral, What I see going wrong is the process isn't working. We should try the process harder. We go back to the books, we read it again, we try and make that technique work, and we don't pay close attention to our context. We don't find theories or laws that we're not applying, and we lose track of what was valuable to us in our organization. There's a quote from Albert Einstein, and apparently it does take an Einstein to figure this out, this quote is, a perfection of means and a confusion of aims seems to be our main problem. And for me, I'm seeing a lot of perfection of means and an omission or us forgetting what the point was. So we build software in order to get some positive outcome. So let me leave you a couple models, and I am going to talk right up until 10 o'clock. We start with, let's explain what I mean by this, that we start with an idea of the world as it is. And in my little drawing, there are smiley faces, not smiley faces. The world as it is has problems, has things we can fix, and we can imagine a world where people are happy, where we've got software, where the software we build solves their problems. And in between those two worlds, we start by thinking of these solution ideas, things that we could build that would make the world better. And these are ideas, these are hypotheses. We sometimes call those things features or capabilities, or even worse, we call them requirements. And we come up with requirements, and we put them into a nice development process where we iteratively and incrementally build, and we end up with some delivery into that world. Everything up until then, where we convert those features into something we can deliver, is what I want to call output. In Agile development, we're really good at that output stuff. We measure it with velocity. We burn it down with burn-down charts. We make sure that output is high quality with unit tests and acceptance tests. But what we're really fishing for is this stuff at the end. It's the outcome. It's what happens in the world after we deliver the software. We don't have good language for talking about that. We don't have good ways to measure it. We don't have simple burn-up charts where each time it burns up, we know there's another person happy. It's not a simple thing. And we keep focusing on, where I started, that the idea is to go faster, to deliver faster. But that's not the point. In fact, our job is to minimize the output while maximizing the outcome. It's not about speed, it's about benefit. So to refresh, we've got output, which is the stuff we build. We've got outcome, which is the response we're hoping for. And we build this, but we want that. So we focus on those things. And given the value of maximizing those positive outcomes, we start to realize it's important to add practice in to learn about the world as it is. How would I know what to do to come up with good ideas if I didn't understand the world as it is? Once we start coming up with solutions, we need to imagine as possible solutions, lots of them, and figure out how to evaluate those. And then as we start to build software, we need to evaluate that stuff that we're building. Working with a friend of mine, David Hussman, we had talked about, we didn't coin them, but in trying to wheedle this out and come up with simple language, we talked about the terms delivery and discovery. In Agile development, we're really good at delivery. We focus on it a lot, we build it, we build software, we measure it, and we optimize our throughput of delivery. But we don't pay a lot of attention to the discovery, the learning about the world, the imagining of solutions, the evaluating the working solutions. That's the stuff we don't account for. In fact, it's the stuff we blame the product owners for not doing well enough at. So let's talk about some learning practice for a minute. And Well, you'll see where common Agile practice starts to go wrong. Take a breath for a minute and imagine you're Jane Goodall. That's Jane Goodall. And imagine you wanted to understand chimpanzees. And an Agile person runs up to you and says, if you really want to understand chimpanzees, there's a practice we have called, wow. Is that right? Yeah, there it is. Okay, we have a practice called chimpanzee on site, where we go to the jungle and we bring back some chimps and we put them in your office, and they're right there. If you want to understand them, all you have to do is swivel your chair to the left and ask. And we think this is the best way for you to really understand chimpanzees. That isn't, and we can imagine that. And we can imagine that the best way to really understand chimpanzees is to go where they are. And as it turns out, the best way to really understand people and the problems they're having is not to bring them on site, but to go where they are, to see the problems they're having. So if I look at the learning approaches, I've prepared these high-resolution charts. At the lower end, if we really want to learn, we might have a user proxy, someone who used to be a user there on site. Maybe one level above might be actual users on site or visiting us. One level above that would be frequent visits to users and observing them using their product. And then when I find organizations that are really learning organizations, they have steady pools of users that they can get to very quickly, and those pools aren't polluted by going to the same people over and over. They continuously try and build up the pools full of people they can learn from. So organizations that are built to learn do a lot of this. There's a quote from a paper called the New Product Development Game. This is an '86 paper, and it's notable because in this paper they compared product development to what looked like rugby. And this is the paper, when read by the people that founded Scrum, resulted in the Scrum name because they couldn't call it rugby. So the big green part from this paper is, by stationing themselves for a year, even on weekends, at, I don't know where, Bit-In, an NEC service center in the middle of wherever that is, talking with hobbyists and learning the user's viewpoint. There's multiple instances in this paper that founded what is Scrum today about going to where the users are to learn from them. It's the part that we scratched out. I'm not exactly sure why, which makes me think of the Woody Allen quote that 90% of life is just showing up. Organizations that do this is a quick photo of working with people, spend a lot of time learning informally and in context. So if we came up with ideas, in Agile development, we've got this idea of test first. Well, what would test first mean if we were trying to evaluate whether the concepts we had were working? Well, we would at first, or at minimum, talk about the world with our solution in it, or talk about the user's experience. If we wanted to better understand it or be on the same page, we might sketch it and see what it looks like. We might notch that up a level by collaboratively sketching lots of different possible solutions. And if we were going to notch that up a level, we might paper prototype and test those things internally. And then a level above that would let us, prototype and test with end users actually working with the software. If we really wanted to test, we'd do that. Not with the working software, but with the concepts that were most likely to fail. And again, these are the concepts that fail more than half the time. Just quick photos of in organizations that are doing this stuff, I see lots of people taking the discussion about user experience into public and collaboratively working together to sketch. And I think we've got some folks from Adaptive Path here, and I'm not going to show this full video because of time. I like Adaptive Path for inventing a lot of collaborative ways to work and imagine what software should be. A short video of what they refer to as Sketchboard is a way for everyone to pile in and sketch what might be possible ideas for the software. Just let it run for just a second, because really I have 1 minute. I'm seeing an explosion of practices like this that let people imagine what the product looks like, and attention paid to the whole team being brought along. There's a practice called Design Studio, which is a lot like Sketchboard, that involves, that asserts we need to involve the development team, the QA people, everyone involved with building the software. And then, we can't possibly see that video. So let's move on to this last kind of moment of truth. As we start to build software, we need to start to evaluate that working software. Now, the weakest of possible practices we could use is a sprint review or a product demo or a show and tell. This lets us see the software, but if anyone's done this kind of stuff before, you know that seeing it isn't, I've shown a lot of software that people have liked until they actually start to use it. One notch above that is to start to put yourself in the shoes of the user and evaluate the software as if we were using it. I'm seeing the Agile testing community moving towards this with session-based testing, with exploratory testing, and it's possible from the UX community to start doing, usability testing a lot earlier. Ideally, we could get this software in front of people who are actually users and watch them perform real tasks and see how well they do. And then, an even better, a notch up, is what's the earliest we could build something and get it to someone that could use it in their context. Now, if it was important that we do that and learn from people using it in their context as early as possible, we might build things that are a little bit rougher, from an engineering perspective. Maybe all the dots weren't quite connected, all the features weren't in place, but by putting just enough of it in there and getting it to people, we could watch it be used and we could learn quickly whether it was the right thing to build and not wait until it was perfect. It's these moments of truth around imagining possible solutions and around evaluating solutions that start to be discovery, that start to be learning. So let's see if I can very quickly finish Globo's story here. Basically, Globo was missing some things, some values, some things that were important to them. The Scrum Masters had been enforcing good Scrum process prior to that. This is one of the main Scrum Masters. His name is Igor, and quick photo of he and I. But instead of enforcing product owner taking responsibility, it was important to Igor, or important to Juarez, that everybody shared responsibility. Now, the truth was the product owner did make decisions, but how do we all share responsibility? Because we wanted product success, it was important to get deep user and customer understanding. And because it was important we did those things, they worked on building a toolkit of discovery practice. On the last phone call I had with Igor, he was telling me about, just over the last few months, the profound changes that he had seen. The quality of collaboration between product owners that had gone way up, that Scrum Masters were focusing on and calling people on hey, you don't understand the product, or you don't understand the users. As a rule, developers and product owners were going out to visit users on site. Developers were watching users use their product, and it was those tactics that started to build shared ownership. And it's focusing on those values that it started to pour in a lot of practices that have started to make sense for Globo. So let's see if I can recap here. The things that end up working for me are to value outcome over output. It's the real goal here isn't the process, the goal is the outcome. We need to balance the delivery work we do and the discovery work we do. Are we doing as much to understand the problems we're trying to solve and validate them as we are to build high-quality software? And then finally, this avoiding this process racket by taking ownership of your own process, not delegating ownership to an expert or to a book or to someone else. Pay attention to what's valuable to you. Pay attention to what's possible and what's emerging as far as techniques go, but it's your process, and if it doesn't work, it's not the process's fault. It's probably yours. And with that, that's the end. Thanks very much for listening, and I'm not sure if we have time for questions.